Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about the Final Shape dev tuning article on ability tuning. This one is quite a bit different from the weapon tuning changes. It goes over every single subclass in the game, as well as two specific supers, which you can see probably from the title of this video and from this huge image I have on the left side here, Well of Radiance and Ward of Dawn, which are two big universal global buff sources that have been in the game for a long time now, and Bungie is going to talk about them in particular. I've summarized the important changes and bolded them on the right side in this document here, but I'm still going to be talking about each individual change, my thoughts, and what I think the game will look like going forward in endgame PvE. Let's start off with Well of Radiance. Now, I'm actually going through this article out of order. For whatever reason, Bungie decided to talk about Stasis first because it probably got the most changes out of any subclass, and then they moved to Well Bubble, and then they did the other subclasses. But I'm going to kind of break up the flow a little bit and keep it in a more logical order. We're going to start with Well and Bubble, and then we're going to move on to all the subclass changes. Let's start off with Well of Radiance. Well of Radiance received a number of changes. They want to basically move it into a more offensive direction and have it be less of a defensive crutch. The problems with Well were twofold, right? You have too much sustain, right? You can just sit in a well, face tank any hard content pretty much without having to really think about dodging crucial abilities or maybe using some sort of, cover. You can really just face tank damage. So that was one of the problems. And the other problem was that there's not really a drawback to using Well, right? Besides the fact that I guess these days it can break, there's not much of a drawback to having Well. And if your Well breaks, you can always just place another one. So let's see what changes Bungie has implemented to combat these problems that we've talked about. So first, they're giving us Radiant for 8 seconds upon leaving the well. I don't think this does anything, to be honest with you. Besides maybe if your well breaks or if your well runs out, you don't really need to place another well if it's at the tail end of damage. This is kind of nice because some damage phases last around 30 seconds. A lot of Destiny 2 boss damage phases last 30 seconds, and well itself also lasts 30 seconds. So if you pre-place your well and then it kind of runs out toward the end of damage, this will guarantee that you have that 25% buff for the entirety of the damage phase. However, it's pretty easy to get Radiant. This is, I suppose, nice for Goldie users because when they leave the well, they'll have normal Radiant rather than Well Radiant, which overrides their Radiant and makes their Goldie do less damage. So that's a bit of a quality of life change, but I don't think this changes fundamentally Well's purpose, Well's usage, right? Next, we have this nerf from 100 HP per second to 50 HP per second. This is one of the two big changes to Well. Basically, what Well does now is that it gives you Restoration Tier 2 the entire time while you're in Well. Before, it gave you like a hidden kind of Tier 3, where if you were in the well, you would get healed an incredible amount, literally half your health every second. Now that's been halved, right? So that's one big change. It'll be harder to face tank damage now. And the second big change, which we'll just skip to here, is that the damage reduction of Well has gone down from 40%, which is absolutely massive. For reference, Woven Mail is 45%. So just for being in this super for 30 seconds, you have 40% damage resist against bosses. This has been nuked down to a quarter of its original value, to 10%. So maybe you'll see in the future Warlocks putting stag rifts in Well, or maybe, throwing down extra healing sources during damage, or perhaps you'll see more Woven Mail usage during damage, maybe Frost Armor, which we'll talk about later on in this video. But this is a good change for the game. It means that Well is not such a brain dead, place it, leave it on, just do damage type of thing. And some of the changes that I'm seeing them apply to Pantheon have also forced the game into a more dynamic direction, where you can't afford to just sit in one spot and kind of face tank a boss and just focus on doing damage. It becomes a much more dynamic sandbox that way. So this is, I think these are good changes. There were a lot of ways, a lot of directions they could have gone with this. When I did that subclass tier list with Celtic Repo and above, we discussed a lot of potential options. I got a lot of comments with people giving us a lot of different ideas, but I think this is not a bad way to start. Now, I see a lot of people on Twitter already going up in arms saying, oh, Warlocks have been released from Well duty, it's over, Well is no more, whatever. People always overreact to nerfs and buffs in every video game, whether it's League of Legends, Overwatch, Destiny 2, whatever game you play, people always overreact to buffs and nerfs. Anytime something is buffed, it becomes broken. There's YouTubers that make clickbait thumbnails with their enraged, larger-than-life face reactions of them reacting to something getting buffed. And whenever something gets nerfed, oh, it's over. It's over for that weapon or that armor or whatever it is, right? And yes, this is an obviously strong nerf to Well, but think about it like this. Well fills a purpose, right? It fills a role in a team composition. if Well has been nerfed, what replaces Well? A Titan Sunspot? A Titan Barricade? A Bubble? No. A Titan's Rampart's Shield? No. Banner Shield? No, not really, right? So what's going to replace Well? Nothing will replace Well. What is your other sources of restoration times 2? Oh wait, they're on Solar Warlock, right? So if you want to survive during a damage phase, the best option is still going to be Well. Now, will it be a little bit harder to survive in a Well? Will it be a little bit more punishing? Certainly yes, but there is nothing in the game that replaces a Well of Radiance right now. There is, if you need to do damage and you want to put down a place of safety where your whole team can gather for a buff source instead of having everybody individually get their own buffs, Well is that, right? Which I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but this certainly doesn't mean Well is over, right? Well is gone. You know, you don't need to use Well anymore. Oh, you know, it's nerfed into the ground or anything like that. This is still obviously the strongest option for a collective zone where everybody in a raid, dungeon, whatever, needs to do damage, right? And obviously, even if you're solo, it's a great way to protect yourself when you're doing damage so that you don't need to worry about chip environmental damage and constantly being on the lookout for healing. So, Well is obviously still very strong. Now, another 2 changes that we're going to go over, some minor changes. Well now heals you to full on cast. Apparently, it used to heal you for 40 HP. I didn't really notice this, but I guess this makes it a better panic super. I don't know if it heals your teammates, but if it heals you on cast, I think it's 300 HP now, which is essentially full health. So that's kind of nice. That's kind of cool. It's a good panic button, right? Which I think it kind of already was, but you know, it's a good panic button. And the amount of kills you can get from killing enemies while you're in your Well, because it counts as super damage, has gone up to 5 orbs, right? Instead of 4 orbs. So I suppose that's nice, but I don't think these 2 changes really do that much, right? Okay, next up we have Bubble. Now, Bubble, a lot of this is PvP changes because bubbles were quite oppressive in PvP, as I'm sure you know. It's very hard to kill an enemy that's inside of a bubble. You'd have to like conditional finality a Titan and then like, you know, conditional them twice or like conditional melee them a bunch and, you know, then they would die. So yeah, I think this is largely targeted towards PvP, right? Like effective health of players inside the Ward of Dawn is significantly lower than it was before in PvP. But these changes, they're saying we want to make Bubble more defensive and less offensive. So we want to kind of split the 2 supers and make one offensive, one defensive. Now the problem is that Bubble doesn't even do defense very well, in my opinion, right? Generally speaking, creating a zone of safety in this game can be valuable, but artificial cover does that pretty well. Like natural artificial cover does that pretty well. And Bubble, I don't know, like the DR, that the health that the Bubble has and the armor / DR that you get while using the Bubble is not high enough to really make that trade-off worth using. And the removal of that damage buff and moving it to Helm of Saint 14, I also don't think this does anything, because now people are just going to run Helm of Saint 14, which is like fine. I mean, I guess it means that you can't run it during a GM, but I don't know, most people don't really run Void Titan in GMs for like optimal play anyway, where they're trying to like buff their teammates, so I don't think that's really a big deal. I think this gradual Void Overshield might be kind of annoying in PvP, because previously the deal was in PvP is that you don't peek out of the bubble, right? You stay in the bubble, you kind of hunker down, and then they either have to come inside the bubble and die, or they have to break the bubble, or they have to kind of aggress. Right now, you can kind of be on the outskirts of the bubble, and you have this Void Overshield that slowly ticks you up. So I don't know, this might be a little bit annoying in PvP, but I don't really care that much about that. And then of course there's this orb generation opportunity on top of the 3 that you generate from placing the bubble. So yeah, again, the problems with Bubble, doesn't compete with Well, which I suppose they're maybe not trying to make it compete with Well. You can't shoot through the bubble, right? Which is obviously that would be very broken in PvP, but you can't shoot through the bubble. And the main thing is that the defensive trade-off is not really worth using. It's not really worth using. It's not something where like you can plunk it down on a boss, or you can plunk it down in the middle of tons and tons of ads, and you'll like really survive for a long time, especially in high level content. And I don't know, it's more of like I guess it's like a stall tactic a bit, but it's not really that strong, and I don't think these changes really do much, especially because they said effective health of players inside the Ward of Dawn Dome remains roughly the same as it was before PV, you know, versus PV and combat. So I don't know, this change I don't think really does much. If anything, it's a Bubble nerf, which Bubble certainly didn't need. Anyways, let's move, not down, but up to Stasis. Now, a lot of Stasis changes. I've tried my best to summarize the important ones. I've kind of ignored or glossed over the PvP ones. Again, the bolded text is going to be what I think is important. So, what were the problems with Stasis subclasses until now, you know, during Lightfall? So, problems. Number 1, Stasis has a less consistent gameplay loop than other subclasses. For example, Arc, you have Arc Hunter, you get your melee back every dodge, you get your dodge back every melee, very straightforward. Arc Titan, Arc Warlock, you know, aspects like Arc Soul, and you know, exotics like Heart of Inmost Light gave arc subclasses, you know, a very consistent gameplay loop, right? You have a lack of sustain. Now, there's some damage resist. You have Whisper of Chains, you have Whisper of Rhyme, but the, you know, the risk reward analysis on those two things, not that great, right? For example, Whisper of Rhyme, you need a lot of shards to keep that overshield going, right? So obviously, you know, not great in PvP because people could run Behemoth Titan a lot, but if you were just a solo player running Stasis, you need a lot of shards to really make use of Rhyme, right? That's number one. And number two is Whisper of Chains. I mean, you can be near frozen targets, but again, you're near a bunch of enemies in a sandbox where other people have access to healing or just natural damage resist from Woven Mail, or invisibility or devour, right? Compared to all of that, Stasis sustain was not very strong, right? So that's number two. Number three is Stasis lacks offensive potency. This was the endgame PvE community's biggest complaint with Stasis. When people started using it, for example, using Stasis turrets and GM Glassway and just spamming it and basically sitting in the back and shooting enemies one at a time, Stasis could CC enemies, but it lacked strong offensive potency. Now, we've seen that the other darkness subclass, Strand, has improved upon this a little bit, right? You see, you know, Whirling Maelstrom on Hunter, or Grapple Meleeing on Titan, or Threadlink Spam on Warlock, or even, you know, Weaver's Trance. Like, all of these things have some level of splash damage, right? Stasis really kind of had an issue with that from the beginning, right? It felt a little bit clunky, and it's always had kind of this lack of a strong offensive potency where you're kind of weaving abilities in all the time and just killing a bunch of enemies all the time. You're kind of just slowing them or freezing them. So let's see what Bungie has done to address this problem. So first, it seems they're addressing the lack of sustain. Frost Armor is a new thing. So Stasis Shard Overshields are going away, and now Frost Armor is essentially, I like to think of it like Woven Mail. It's like Woven Mail, but it has better uptime. So Woven Mail, as you've seen, lasts for 10 seconds, depending on the source. Now, obviously, with Threat of Warding nerf, it's going to be 5 seconds, but some sources still give you 10, right? And so Woven Mail is 45% damage resist. Frost Armor at maximum stacks at 8 stacks. So once you pick up 8 shards, you will get 36% damage resist. Okay, so it is worse than Woven Mail, but the upside is that it lasts for 13 seconds at max rather than 10, and I would argue that it's a little bit easier to refresh than something like Threat of Warding, especially if Threat of Warding overwrites previous sources of 10 seconds of Woven Mail down to 5, right? So 5 is obviously much lower. It's lower than even the minimum time, even if you don't have Whisper of Rhyme on, right? So Frost Armor no longer provides an overshield, it's just damage resist. It's basically like Woven Mail, except for it interacts a little bit differently in terms of how you get it. So how do you get Frost Armor? Well, let's look at this. I've written down all like the different options. You have picking up Stasis Shards, which is going to be the biggest one, right? Bungie has buffed the generation opportunities for Stasis Shards. So picking up Stasis Shards will give you Frost Armor along with a little bit of health, which we'll talk about in a second. And some exotics also give you Frost Armor. So Renewal Grasps, now take this as you will. Renewal Grasp has received a buff and a nerf at the same time, right? So the buff is that obviously if you have Whisper of Rhyme on, after 8 seconds, you will have 36% global damage resist, which is higher than what you used to get, which was a flat 25% damage resist. So whenever you threw a Dusk Field with Renewal Grasps, you would have 25% damage resist from all targets as long as you were inside the Dusk Field. Now you get 1 stack of Frost Armor every 0.9 seconds. So it'll take you around 5-6 seconds to match the old value, which means if you're in a panic situation and you're throwing down the Dusk Field to get a little damage resist, it's not going to be active immediately. It's more of a slow burn type of exotic. So take that as you will. It's either a buff or a nerf. Regardless of what it is a change. So it's something you should be aware of. Also, it does repeatedly refresh the duration. That is something Bungie mentioned over here, I believe. Yeah, it'll reset your timer over and over every second. So you can think of this as having however long the Dusk Field lasts, whether it's 8 seconds, 9 seconds, whatever it is, plus an additional 13 seconds if you have Whisper of Rhyme, because you get refreshed at the end. So along with some of the uptime changes in this patch, this will mean that Renewal Grasp has a pretty good uptime on Frost Armor, on max stacks of Frost Armor even. So good stuff there. Ballador's Wrathweavers is also, instead of getting that Stasis Shard Overshield for 50 HP and 50% DR on that Overshield, you now get Frost Armor on cast or on your right-click Shockwave from Winter's Wrath. Now, the thing is, I don't think Bungie mentioned how much Frost Armor you get. If it's just 1 stack, that's pretty pitiful. So I would imagine that you get maybe multiple stacks, maybe 3 or 4 every time you cast your Rift, but I don't know. Right, so if it's just 1 Frost Armor stack, that's a little disappointing. I think that is worse than the Overshield that you used to get from just casting your Rift on Ballador's, but hopefully I'm wrong, and hopefully it's maybe 3 or 4 stacks, something like that. Next up, Whisper of Fractures has changed. Now when you melee shatter a frozen target, you get a frost armor stack. I'm not really sure what class this really applies to. I mean, on Warlock, you're certainly not really melee shattering frozen targets. On Hunter, I don't think you are. Maybe on Titan, if it counts like Howl of the Storm damage as shattering frozen targets. But given some of the changes to some of the other fragments, I think you'll probably want to prioritize them over something like Whisper of Fractures. So we'll see what happens. Next up, we have Stasis Shards. So like I said, when you pick them up, you get health and frost armor, right? Which is nice. Like again, what we were saying, Stasis has a lack of sustain, right? And sustain, you have two options. You have health regen and you have damage resist. And so, for example, Strand, Banner of War, health regen, Woven Mail, damage resist. And now on Stasis Shard pickup, you get health, and then you get frost armor, damage resist. So they've given it kind of both elements. Now we'll see how strong this amount of health is. We'll see how strong the DR ends up feeling like and playing like in actual gameplay. But yeah. ICD on rapid creation. So now there's an internal cooldown on rapid creation. This is mostly a targeted PvP nerf apparently, because obviously if you stacked 3 Behemoth Titans and Trials, you could just spam stasis crystals and just barricade them and create a bunch of shards and run around with a bunch of overshield. Now I suppose what they're trying to do is, if you have a bunch of people and they're trying to create a bunch of stasis shards, there will be a cooldown. But if you're just playing normally and trying to create stasis shards at a normal rate, it won't really affect you. I have a feeling this will be overtuned a little bit, and you'll probably feel the effects even in PvE if you have a good build on, but hopefully I'm wrong. So moving on, how do you get stasis shards, right? I wanted to kind of briefly go over the different sources. There's 2 new fragments, Whisper of Chill and Whisper of Chains got reworked. It's not a DR fragment anymore. So first of all, Whisper of Chill, it seems like when you get specifically stasis weapon kills, you will get a stasis shard. Now it says it's a chance, right? But it has similar wording to to Spark of Discharge on Arc. And the way that worked, it was a counter progression. So depending on what kind of enemy you killed, you would get a different amount of counter progress. So for example, a red bar would give you a third of the counter, so you need 3 kills. So probably I would assume the same logic is being applied here. There's some similar language that's being applied across all of these changes. So I'm going to assume that it's also kind of the same logic applies to Spark of Discharge and Whisper of Chill. Whisper of Change is kind of a similar fragment to Whisper of Chill. I'm not sure why they made 2 separate ones, but regardless, if you get 3 kills of any kind, not just stasis weapon kills, but any kind, while you have frost armor, you'll get a stasis shard. So this is kind of similar to like an Empyrean or something like that, right? It extends, allows you to continue your gameplay loop if you currently have a subclass buff, right? Okay, and then obviously the 3 harvest aspects are going to allow you to create shards from a variety of different ways. Tectonic Harvest was changed so that now shattering frozen targets allows you to create stasis shards, which is kind of nice because you know, Stasis Titan does tend to shatter targets a fair amount. So yeah, I think that's a nice change, nice quality of life change. And now we're going to go over aspects and miscellaneous changes. So aspects, Isolar Worlds, I don't think this will make a huge difference. Like 5 Seekers was already a lot, but 5 to 7, sure, nice. Winter Shroud is interesting. Now Winter Shroud was largely, in terms of neutral gameplay, pretty useless in my opinion. The only place I really had it on was for a Bombardiers build, where when you dodge, it makes a slowing projectile and or a slowing little bomb parting gift, and your Shroud would allow you to instantly freeze a target because the slow stacks from the parting gift as well as your dodge slow would instantly freeze. It would build up to 100 stacks. Now this stuff is kind of nice though. Class regen rate on slow, right? And damage resist on dodge. Now, I don't know if these things are intrinsically tied to the actual activation of the aspect, but if they are not, this would be very good for RDM Shuriken users. So you get class regen rate on any slow, right? So any slow, if it's unbound to the actual aspect, and you get damage resist on dodge, which is also nice for RDM Shuriken users. So if you are someone that likes using Radiant Dance Machine Shuriken build, this sounds good. This sounds cool. Besides that though, I don't think this is necessarily super great. Maybe on Mask of Bacchus build users, it's pretty good. But besides that, I think the other Hunter aspects are a little bit more relevant. So next up, we have Touch of Winter. Glacier Grenades are now going from 6 to 7 crystals. So previously, if you were not aware, Touch of Winter Glaciers basically had a sort of like a hexagon shape, right? 6 crystals, and I'm assuming they're going to fill that middle bit with a 7th crystal. So this doesn't really change too much for PvE in my opinion, but what it does change in speedrunning is default spawn manipulation. If you guys are not aware, you can block spawn points off with stasis crystals in order to manipulate your spawn point. And one of the problems with Touch of Winter Glaciers is that they had a hole in the middle. So now that the hole is filled up, it's cool, right? It's becomes easier to use. So there's that. Touch of Winter Cold Snaps now also duplicate and create larger crystals, like medium and large, once they chain more and more times. I don't think this is like a huge change, but maybe I'll see something interesting with it. We'll see. But I think on Hunter, Touch of Winter, Glaciers, and Duskfields are generally perceived to be stronger. Okay, miscellaneous changes. Whisper of Torment. This is really nice, right? I bolded this. You get 12% of your grenade back with Frost Armor per damage event. Now, this percentage value is affected by what kind of grenade you're using, right? So the base CDR versus like, you know, scaled CDR is different ever since that change. So it's probably not going to end up being 12%, but it is still nice, right? You're going to have Frost Armor all the time on Stasis if you're playing it correctly. And I believe they've changed the behind the scenes effects of Whisper of Torment to be a lot simpler. So now it's just every damage event, you get 12%, which is like really good, right? Really good. So I'm happy with that. Next up, we have Whisper of Reversal, which is a new fragment. So with Frost Armor, dealing or taking contact melee damage will slow whatever hit you or whatever you hit. I don't know why, but there's like 2 fragments now that are related to punching frozen targets or like being near targets and punching them on Stasis. Stasis doesn't really have strong melees, right? Like Warlock melee is not that great. Hunter melees are okay, and then Titan melee is like also not that great in PvE, so kind of confusing. And I'm not really sure how this would like work in PvP either, because I think getting Frost Armor in PvP not going to be like super easy. I don't know, maybe. Anyways, I don't think this is going to be like super impactful. Shiver Strike got 10% damage buff, don't care. Better tracking, sure, don't care. Silence and Squall, okay. Now this super got some better targeting, right? It did have some issues where it would kind of travel past the boss and onto some ads. Now hopefully it'll linger on a boss a bit better, but it also has a 40% increased tick rate on the damage and slow. So if you know how Silence and Squall works, it kind of summons a blizzard tornado on a target, and that target would tick, 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 and slow and then freeze, and slow and then freeze and shatter all the time, right? So that damage rate got increased. Now theoretically this is a 40% damage buff to Silence and Squall. Now Silence and Squall is very bad for damage, so for those of you who are, you know, kind of discussing this with me, or I was seeing this kind of discussed, no, this will not make Silence and Squall meta or anything like that. It's already very far behind other damage supers, but it is nice, right? Like I don't disagree with this, you know, it's a good change. Silence and Squall is a very weak super when it comes to actually damaging something. So I'm a fan, right? And obviously it'll make it better for just PvE like roaming super as well. When I say roaming super, I mean the super roaming around and killing ads, not you roaming. Diamond Lance, quality of life changes to pickup and detonation radius. It's just going to make it a little bit more effective. It also shatters crystals, which is cool, I guess. But the main thing I think is the detonation radius. It having a bigger detonation radius obviously just increases its effectiveness. I have a Cadmus Ridge Lance Cap build, which I suppose I'll try at some point, maybe post-change, see if it feels any different, but I don't think it will. And then this is kind of interesting. So they've doubled base shatter damage. Apparently bosses were taking 2 instances of shatter damage whenever they auto like unfroze and auto shattered. So yeah, that's kind of annoying, I suppose. So it doesn't really change on bosses, but what it does change is shatter damage in regular neutral PvE on non-boss targets. So that's pretty nice. You might actually see like glacier spam builds maybe become a little bit stronger, right? So I'm kind of interested in that. I'm kind of interested in Howl of the Storm being coded as melee damage and shatter damage, maybe getting like a kind of a double dip with this and maybe some melee exotic. So I'm interested in that. But again, a lot of these things are things we're gonna have to play out and see how good they are. But overall, I would say the Stasis changes are pretty good, right? I think Frost Armor is pretty nice. I think this DR scaling, I mean, given how strong Woven Mail is, I guess the timer duration is kind of the trade-off that they're kind of going for here, but I don't know. I think it's all right. I think it's all right. I think it's a step in the right direction, certainly. But unless this shatter damage thing really takes off, I don't think the offensive potency is necessarily really there yet. I think the sustain has improved significantly, and I think the gameplay loop issues maybe have been largely fixed. Stasis shards sounds like they're very plentiful. It sounds like they give you ability energy based on kind of what subclass and stuff you have on. And it looks like Whisper of Torment, that buff, that's a lot, right? That's a lot. So I'm excited to see how that goes, and yeah, we'll see you in the final shape, and hopefully Stasis will be a little bit more playable. Okay, moving on, let's talk about Arc. So the problems that I tend to note with Arc are that it, generally speaking, lacks the strong sustain that other classes have or other subclasses have, right? So Arc Warlock, obviously you have your Healing Rift. Arc Warlock probably has the best sustain out of all of them, right? It has a Healing Rift, and the Healing Rift has basically 100% uptime if you have teammates near you because of Arc Soul's intrinsic effect. Hunter, right? Arc Hunter. Now Arc Hunter kind of requires you to get up close and personal to get that regen from combination blow. And besides that, it doesn't really have any strong like damage resist or any like strong healing, so that's kind of a problem. And then Arc Titan obviously only has knockout, and knockout is maybe even worse than Arc Hunter's effect, because it requires you to be up close and personal, and now it's going to heal you for a little bit but not too much, right? So it lacks sustain. And then number 2, I think Arc kind of suffers from being one-dimensional in their kits, right? A lot of, I would say, subclass 3.0s have the issue where they have a clear set of 2 aspects that should be used for PvE, and they have a PvP aspect, and they have some PvP fragments, right? And while some subclasses have escaped this kind of paradigm, I think Arc really has the biggest problem with it, right? So for example, in PvE, you would use Electrostatic Mind, Arc Soul on Warlock, and then boom, Lightning Surges for PvP. On Titan, you would use Knockout, and you would use Touch of Thunder, and then Juggernaut is for PvP. And then on Hunter, you would use Flow State and Lethal Current, and then you would use Tempest Strike in PvP. You see where I'm going with this? So you have a very clear set of PvE aspects, and then you have a PvP aspect, and then what the class does, what the subclass does, is very evident from what you're doing, right? Arc Hunter, very evident that you should be melee spamming. It's not really a super grenade spammy build. It's very obvious you should be melee spamming. Arc Titan, maybe do some grenades, some knockout damage, but also kind of lacks a strong identity in my opinion. And then Arc Warlock is just rift spamming, right? Rift spamming, Arc Souls. That's kind of the whole thing that it does, right? Whereas some of these other subclasses, they're a little bit more versatile. So with that in mind, let's look at what was changed. Arc Staff changes, I don't think matter, right? You can read this if you want, I don't think they matter. Disorienting Blow, I also don't think matters. It's also a 10-second CDR from 100 to 90, so again, not super large or anything like that. These changes are nice, right? The Thunderclap change, very nice because I think it's easily the most viable of these 3, but these 2 changes will make me want to try Tempest Strike and Lightning Surge on certain Hunter and Warlock builds that do not necessarily require one of those PvE aspects. So for example, if you guys remember, some of my Arc Hunter builds that I was making on stream, I put Tempest Strike in them because some of them are very clearly not designed for meleeing, right? So I kind of went against the grain. I said, okay, this Arc Hunter build is not specifically about meleeing, right? It doesn't have Assassin's Cowl on. It's going to be about maybe Radiant Dance Machines dodging and spamming Song of Iruyut kills with Volt Shot. So on a build like that, having Tempest Strike is a bit better, and seeing this viability increase, having that lingering DR, so that it's not maybe just like a PvP thing and it's not just completely int to like use Lightning Surge in the middle of a bunch of ads, is not necessarily like a horrible idea that you'll be punished for. And then Thunderclap obviously loves this change, absolutely loves this change, because Thunderclap is mostly, I would say, a PvE melee, and it is quite good with point contact cannon brace, which we'll talk about in a second. So Ball Lightning, QOL change. Chain Lightning, don't think it will change much, but a QOL change regardless. I think they doubled its chain damage secondary, but it's not like a huge change anyway. Thunderclap, buffed by 20 to 33% depending on charge. Very nice, very nice. Knockout also buffed, which will affect Thunderclap, right? So both these things kind of are a stacked buff to Thunderclap. Now, Thunderclap was already doing pretty decent damage to majors, mini bosses, and the like if you were given the chance to use it in the right opportunities. So, point contact cannon brace will probably see some viability increase from this change. Knockout has been reworked. It no longer gives you regen that can be interrupted, right? So the way Knockout used to work is if you got a melee kill, you would instantly start your health regen, but this health regen can be interrupted just like any other health regen. So it's been reworked to be kind of a weaker version of Devour, when if you get that Knockout proc, depending on the enemy type that you kill, you will get a little bit of HP back. So it can be anywhere between 50, 75, 100. So it gives you some HP back. It's like mini Devour, but it is obviously a little bit more risky. So I think that's nice. I think that's really nice for Thunderclap. Storm Grenade tracking was improved on Touch of Thunder. Don't really care. 20% more damage, not on the Touch of Thunder variant. Specifically not on the Touch of Thunder variant. The normal Touch of Thunder variant will stay the same. So again, not a major change, which is why I didn't bold it. Lightning Grenade Jolt delayed to first take, don't care. Skip and Arc Bolt Grenades. I suppose people that use Shinobu's Vow and Lucky Raspberry will be a little bit happy about this, but 15% is relatively small. I don't think it's going to change much. And if you've seen the damage values of Skip and Arc Bolt Grenades in the abilities tab of my damage spreadsheet, this really doesn't change much. Spark of Recharge bonus persists until completely full after critical. So the way this used to work is it would give you a very high regen bonus whenever you're critical, right? And basically the way it would work is once you reach shield and you weren't in critical health anymore, it would just stop the Spark of Recharge bonus, right? So this certainly improves the uptime of this fragment. I don't think it's going to be meta or anything. There's a ton of arc fragments that are competing for these slots. I don't think it's going to be meta in PvE, but it is nice in PvP if you use arc in PvP, and this is like a big thing for you. I think it's nice in PvP. Next up, we have Spark of Beacons. Beacons is the one that created a blinding explosion on arc special kills, I believe. So this is pretty nice because it now includes power weapons. Now, those of you that use Thunderlord for ad clear on arc subclasses are probably going to be happy about this. Me specifically, how this will change for me, I have a Radiant Dance Machines build on the Demo Volt Shot Crota machine gun. So I guess this creating arc explosions will be really nice. So that's cool. So I'm happy about that, I suppose. Okay, Solar is up next. Now, Solar really doesn't need much changing, to be honest. I mean, obviously, Well got a change, but Solar is pretty good. And a lot of these changes are quality of life changes or buffing slightly weak parts of slightly weak subclasses, which I think is good. It's a good way to tune things, right? So Lightweight Knife now has a faster animation and you can throw it back to back quickly. And of course, it now has 2 charges intrinsically. It doesn't stack with Ophidia, which I don't think is a big deal because I don't think you were wanting to use a Lightweight Knife on Ophidia specifically. But what this will change is Lightweight Knife is a great way to proc Foe Tracer, right? It has a fast animation, right? Very quick. And the nice thing about Lightweight Knife is that now that it has 2 charges, you can use it with sealed Omkara grasps. A big strategy that I've been touting recently is popping Golden Gun on Celestial Nighthawk, switching to sealed Omkara grasps, and then now you have the ability to do a dodge, and then you throw a knife, and then you do a dodge, right? But now what you can do is you can do a dodge, you can throw a knife, you can throw a knife, and then you can dodge, right? So you can now get 4 reloads off for free after starting on Nighthawk. Now, obviously, you can start on 6 Coyote and kind of achieve a similar effect, but if you start on Nighthawk and switch to 6 Coyote, you're probably not going to get your dodge back on time, right? So being able to proc Sealed Omkara Grasp 4 times, or get 4 reloads, I should say, is pretty nice, right? I think that's the major change with this. I think, like, besides that in PvE, this is not going to change that much, but something I thought was worth mentioning. Okay, knock 'em down, internal cooldown down from 1 second to 0.2 seconds. Those of you who are Solar Hunter players are absolutely familiar with this. I have plenty of times where I'm getting knife kills and I have to pace them very carefully because if I get knife kills too quickly, I just don't get a knife back. And certainly you are not going to get knife kills more often than 0.2 seconds. So this is super, super, super nice. I really love this change. I did not even know that they were aware that this change needed to happen, but I'm really glad that they made this change because now I can throwing knife enemies as quickly as I want and I'll get my knife back all the time. So really, really nice. Thank you, Bungie. Next up, Golden Gun Marksman Orb on crit potency reduced massively. Okay, this is a really big change. Now, those of you who are not familiar, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are, there's a strategy where you can have 4 or 5 Golden Gun Hunters on 3-shot Goldie, right, Marksman Goldie, on starter scales, and what you would do is you would shoot a boss in the crit, dibbable, whatever, 3 times, and every time you crit an enemy on Golden Gun Marksman, it makes 2 orbs at your feet. Even if you don't kill the enemy, it's orb on crit, right? So what you used to be able to do is you would pop your super, you would shoot the boss in the crit 3 times, you would drop 6 super orbs underneath your feet, and your teammates would just pick them up after golding themselves, and you would all just pick up each other's orbs, and then you would have Feast of Light times 4 Golden Gun supers again, and you would just spam this over and over and over. And there's been a team, I believe it's like the Space Force team, there's been a team for a while that has been getting repeatedly good placements, like top 10 day 1 placements over and over by using this strategy, right? And so Bungie finally has put their foot down and said, you know, you probably shouldn't be able to do this, right? It's probably not good for the sandbox. And so they've reduced the super orb potency that is dropped from a Golden Gun Marksman orb from 0.75 times to 0.35 times. So that is basically a 50% nerf. And I don't think you'll be able to do this anymore unless maybe you have 6 hunters. Now, I can't say for sure, right? Because I do know that even with 5 hunters, it was more orbs than you needed, but 50%, right? That's a big nerf, right? So maybe this strat will still be viable, but you're going to have to wait a little bit to get your Goldie back. You're going to have to do some damage in between, right? Maybe get 3 supers off per phase instead of like 6. But we'll see what happens, right? We'll see what happens. Next up, Consecration Ignition, buffed by 20%. And apparently it had some damage resist, maybe like mid-animation, and it didn't get it applied properly, so that was fixed. But the main thing is the Ignition has been buffed by 20%, so that's pretty nice. I think Consecration is already pretty strong on Pyrogale Gauntlets, like those Cyclones. It's pretty strong. But the Ignition being buffed by 20%, I'm not complaining, right? I really like Consecration. I think, you know, it's a great way for Solar Titans to play the game aggressively after their Throwing Hammer nerf. I think arguably it's even a little bit more interesting than Throwing Hammer because it's like a splash ability and you do have to work for getting your melee back. So I'm happy with this change, and I hope people enjoy playing Consecration. Ritz, I think, was tweeting saying that it might be like the new Shield Bash. I don't think it will be. I don't think it's quite that strong. And it's obviously nowhere near as spammable. But I think it's still, you know, it's nice, it's good, I'm happy about it. So yeah, I'm glad. I like Consecration as a neutral PvE option. I think it really strikes a good balance between like OP, just really close range melees, and just having to work for getting your abilities back. So I'm happy about that. Next up, we have Hammer of Soul without Soul Invictus. creates more submunitions. So this is kind of interesting. So typically when you ran Hammer of Soul, you would run Roaring Flames and you run Soul Invictus. Soul Invictus so that you get your Hammer Super to be a longer duration because you're in your sunspots, and then Roaring Flames obviously because it increases the damage of your abilities, right? So now they're saying if you don't run Soul Invictus and you run Roaring Flames Consecration, we will reward you by creating more submunitions from your hammer. So when your hammer explodes, those little kind of fireballs that kind of pop out, you'll get more of them and they will last longer. Okay. Next up we have Swarm Grenade, buffed Linger, tracking, and 20% damage. Swarm Grenade is quite weak, right? It's not very good. That being said, the Linger is a good quality of life change, tracking good quality of life change. 20% damage I don't think is going to do much to this grenade. It's not very competitive right now to begin with, but yeah, good quality of life change. I'm all for buffing weak grenades. Buff Firebolt while you're at it. I'm glad you buffed Skip and Arc Bolt as well. I'm happy with that. Okay. So that's Solar. I think largely good changes, mostly quality of life changes, and of course nerfing the classic Golden Gun chaining strat. So that's cool. All right, moving on. We have Void. Now, Void, I think its biggest problem is the lack of offensive potency. Obviously, all three subclasses have access to Echo Starvation for Devour. So, defensive potency, not really a problem, and invisibility, obviously pretty, available on this subclass as well. But the big problem was the lack of offensive potency, right? The most offensive you were going to get on this subclass is spamming Controverse, Vortex Grenades, or maybe spamming Scatter Grenades on like Arma Titan, or maybe Falcons on Hunter, but none of that compares to anything that is remotely considered strong meta in today's ability sandbox, right? So the big problem was lack of offensive potency. Let's see what Bungie has done to address this problem. So, number one, Snare Bomb and Trapper's Ambush basically leave behind this lingering DOT cloud. Now, I'm not sure how this synergizes with Kepri's Sting, because Kepri's Sting also has a kind of DOT effect on Snare Bombs. So hopefully there is some synergy there, and maybe Kepri's Sting sees some usage that is, not horrible, right? But for now, we'll leave that for the jury to decide once that comes out. Stylus Executioner Weaken applies to Glaive Melee. So this is kind of nice because I had a Glaive Melee build with Triton Vice and Vex Caliber, I believe. And I was like, it'd be really nice if the Glaive Melee counted as a melee for the Stylus Executioner Weaken. And now it does. So I'm really happy with that because it means that you can spam Glaive Melees with Devour and go Invis all the time. So I'm very happy with that. I'm excited to try that build out later on. And I'll, update you guys when I try it out. Okay. Shield Throw has more bounces, lifetime, consistency, and a 20% damage buff. I don't really think this changes much for Shield Throw. I think where it's used, it will continue to remain being used there. So yeah, that's Shield Throw. Next up, we have Offensive Bulwark. Offensive Bulwark now regens a small amount of overshield per melee kill. Now, a big problem with using something like Offensive Bulwark and Controlled Demolition instead of taking something like Bastion is that your overshield would be stripped very quickly in high-level content, and then you would lose out on the benefit of Offensive Bulwark. So having this regen small amount of overshield per melee kill increases your uptime a little bit and makes you just a little bit more survivable, which I'm really happy about because I really used to like running Offensive and Controlled instead of having to rely on Bastion, which I didn't really like as an aspect too much. Okay, next up we have some bolded stuff. Chaos Accelerant Magnetic Grenade, so basically the handheld supernova, the old one. Slightly decreased cooldown when you have Chaos Accelerant equipped, and a 20% damage buff. Now, I believe I did the math here, and sorry, this should say 80%, not 20. But yeah, I think it does 80% of the damage of a Touch of Flame fusion grenade. So not quite there yet in terms of being like super meta, but it is pretty decent, and I'm glad it got buffed. I don't think it's going to change too much though. Next up, we have Pocket Singularity, which is the Warlock charged powered melee. The little void guy that pops out and makes things volatile. Probably one of the weakest powered melees in the game, to be honest. A 50% buff, I don't think it's going to do much, but I could be wrong. I don't think it did much damage to begin with. It did very little damage, but we'll see what happens, right? Nova Bomb, Cataclysm Seekers from 4 to 6. This is kind of nice, right? Now, I assume what they did is they just added 2 Seekers and they didn't just distribute the damage of 4 Seekers to 6. That would suck. So 45% of Nova Bomb damage on Cataclysm is Seeker damage, right? So this is some information for you guys. 45% of it is Seeker damage, which means that this buff, increasing the Seekers by 50%, is a 22.5% buff overall to Nova Bomb damage. And that puts it against Needlestorm as only losing 10% damage against Needlestorm. So it does 90% of the damage of a Needlestorm with Threat of Evolution. So not bad, huh? Not bad, right? I'm not going to say Void is meta or anything because it doesn't have access to like Threat of Ascent, and it's, less of a useful subclass in that regard, but not bad, right? If you want to use Void Warlock, your super's just got a little bit better, right? Nova Bomb Vortex. Now, I'm going to hope that Nova Bomb Vortex, the Linger, they didn't just take the damage from 7 seconds and extend it out for 10 seconds and decrease the DOT to compensate, right? If they kept the DOT the same, Nova Bomb Vortex will have a 43% duration increase, which is a 43% total damage increase, which actually puts it between Needlestorm and Celestial Nighthawk, right? So Needlestorm does around like 400k and Nighthawk does around like 460k, right? So I believe Nova Bomb Vortex will be right in the middle of that, which is like 430k, I believe. So actually quite good. Now, that being said, I'm not really sure if Nova Bomb Vortex DOT stacks across players, but, you know, still certainly not a bad thing. And, you know, I'm happy that it got a little buff, right? Void Super is getting buff. That's always nice. All right, finally, we're going to talk about Strand. Okay, so I think the biggest problems with Strand is that, number one, Woven Mail is a little too accessible for how much DR it gives you, right? 45% DR, that's more than Well DR, that's more than Max Frost Armor DR, right? It's more than a lot of DR sources in the game, more than Renewal Grass, more than whatever, right? So it's a lot of DR, it's too accessible, it's just every orb you get. In a sandbox where we're like basically shitting orbs all the time, you know, you're gonna get a lot of orbs, and so you're gonna have Woven Mail uptime all the time, so it's a little bit OP. And number two is that I think they nerfed Suspend a little bit too hard. I think Salted Greppo has talked about this in the past. That's kind of what drew my attention to it. I think Suspend's been nerfed a little bit too much on non-boss targets, so I think it's a little bit weak in that regard, but I'm glad the offensive potency of Strand has been turned up by some of these new aspects that we've been getting over the past year as Lightfall has continued to progress, and a lot of people have been happy with that as well. Now let's see what changes Bungie has made, because I bolded all of them, okay? So number one, threat of warding duration reduced from 10 to 5 seconds. So I really like this change, right? Number one, because 10 seconds is a long time. It's a long time, right? In this sandbox, it's a long time. 10 seconds per orb. I mean, you're going to get an orb maybe every 5 seconds if you're playing effectively regardless. So 10 seconds was a little too forgiving. And number two, I think that this sets Woven Mail apart from Frost Armor, because Frost Armor goes up to 13 with Whisper of Rymon, right? So I think this kind of separates the two and makes the, you know, Stasis subclass a little bit more defensive and more of a, you know, sustained focused subclass, which I think is nice, right? And obviously it has lower DR as well to compensate. Weaver's Call now creates perched threadlings from killing targets with Strand. Now, I don't think this will change what aspect you use if you were previously using something like Mindspun instead, or if you were previously using something like the Wanderer, right? I don't think it changes who uses what aspects on what build, but I think it does change for those of you that were already using Weaver's Call and maybe you were making like a Swarmer build or something like that, right? This makes it a lot better because Weaver's Call, from killing targets with Strand, you get free threadlings, right? And it's just a good change overall, right? Because your threadling kills will give you threadlings, and then those threadlings will make more threadlings, and it's just an infinite loop. And I'm all for buffing some of the weaker subclass builds in this game, and I think Strand Warlock is maybe one of them. Okay, next up, grapple points no longer fully refresh the duration on the grapple. Now, a lot of people read this incorrectly, and they thought that when you grapple to a grapple point, your grapple wouldn't fully refund. Obviously, that's not what's happening here, because I think that kind of cuts into the power fantasy of using grapple points, of using grapple tangles or whatever. That doesn't really make sense. So what it actually is that grapple points have, I believe it's a 17.5 second duration when you first create them, whether it's using Hunter, you just using their grapple and creating that little sticky point in the air, or whether you're using Navigator, right? So 17.5 seconds after deployment, they will disappear. Now, the way it used to work is that when you grapple to these points, it would refresh that duration all the way back up to 17.5 seconds, right? But now how it works is Bungie changed it so that whenever you grapple, it adds 5 seconds to the timer, then it adds 4 seconds to the timer, then 3, then 2, then 1. Now, the problem with this is that people think this is a nerf to spam grapple meleeing. It is not a nerf to spam grapple meleeing because you grapple around once a second, maybe once every 1.5 seconds anyway. So even if you're at that minimum duration, you are going to be using that grapple point until basically you need to stop using it, right? So let's do some math here. Right? So 17.5, right? You add 5, you get 4, you get 3, you get 2, you had 1, you had 1. Let's say you add 1 a couple times, right? Because you're obviously not going to run out immediately. So that's 35 seconds, right? Is there a boss phase in the game that's longer than 35 seconds? Almost no, right? It's like Ward Priest, and you're not really grapple meleeing Ward Priest, right? And then in terms of neutral gameplay, is there a room or a grapple meleeable radius where you're going to spend more than 35 seconds killing ads? No. So I don't think this really even changes anything at all. Yeah, I really don't think this changes much, right? They're going to have to nerf it more if they really care about, you know, grapple melee points staying up. But I think the other changes that they made are going to be more significant, rather. The other thing, I actually didn't even write this down. So this is quite the change. This is also, obviously this is slightly targeted towards PvP, right? So they mention here, people can grapple toward you, fire a single hand cannon shot, and then grapple melee you, and then you're dead. So the idea here that they're following is you grapple, then you shoot, then you melee. However, obviously most people, the way they do this on Strand Titan PvE is shoot, then grapple, then melee. So it really depends on Bungie's implementation of this nerf, okay? So if they make it so that after you fire your 1-2 punch shotgun, you cannot grapple melee for a set maybe 1.52 seconds, it'll be dead. It'll be Jover, right? Because that is essentially how long 1-2 punch lasts, right? 1-2 punch has a set duration, and if you don't grapple melee during that time, you're going to lose out on the buff. And I believe they said they removed 1-2 punch from the equation. So I don't know if they kind of play tested around grappling and then shooting and then immediately meleeing, or if you're still going to be able to shoot, grapple, melee, which is what most people do. So it really depends on the implementation. That being said, if don't have your hopes up, right? Because if their implementation doesn't work and you're still able to do shoot, grapple, melee, maybe with a more sensitive timing, they're going to patch it again. Okay, it's clear what their intention is, and you know Bungie, if they intend to do something and then it doesn't work, they're going to repatch it, they're going to retread it. Okay, so I would say just grapple meleeing is probably dead with 1-2 punch shotguns. Okay, next up, Into the Fray melee regen was nerfed from 4 to 3 times. Now, the problem with this, Strand Titan was really broken because of infinite grapple melee. Without infinite grapple meleeing, Strand Titan, I think, in my opinion, was for the most part balanced. But of course, Bungie, seeing that Strand Titan has insanely high play rate in these very, difficult content, watching people use Strand Titan all the time for these solo challenges, low man challenges, dungeons, whatever it is, they're like, oh, this is really OP, we should nerf a lot of it, like holistically, right? So a lot got changed here. Into the Fray melee regen from 4 to 3 times. I don't think this necessarily needed to happen. Into the Fray felt good, but it didn't feel OP. Because Into the Fray is not what gives you the ability to grapple melee spam. Into the Fray just gives you Frenzied Blades back faster. And yes, Frenzied Blades are pretty good. They're pretty strong. But are they what makes Strand Titan extremely broken? Not really. Not really. So I'm not necessarily like super against it, right? I don't think it's a bad change, but I don't necessarily think this was like a problematic thing that Into the Fray was doing. So yeah, 4 to 3 times. I mean, 4 is obviously pretty high, but yeah, I don't think this was necessarily a problem. Banner of War max timer from 30 to 24. I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't think a timer nerf is necessarily going to change much, right? Because this really only changes whether or not you keep banner between locations. So a lot of Destiny 2 is built around waiting between waves of ads, or maybe moving from one area to another area, from one encounter to another encounter, right? Maybe in like a GM, moving from room to room. And so this really just makes it so that you don't have to re-get banner if your timer is like 30 seconds. Like, this decreases the forgiveness a little bit. But in terms of keeping banner up, you get so much Banner of War timer refreshes from killing enemies and your teammates killing enemies that you're never going to run out of banner, realistically speaking, in any ad dense or even medium-sized room with ads in it. So I don't think this is necessarily like going to change anything, but I guess it's nice. I mean, I would have personally nerfed maybe healing pulses a little bit, but they did change the melee modifiers, which is the other thing I would have changed. So Syntheseps Blade Fury from 1.4 times to 1.2 times. So I didn't really talk about glaive melee bonuses here because it's not really relevant for the most part, but yes. So for those of you that aren't aware, Syntheseps provides a flat damage buff to super damage while you're surrounded. And so it made Blade Fury one of the highest total damage, if not the highest total damage, supers in the game. So obviously they've scaled it back a little bit, down from 40% to 20%, which is fine. And they've also decreased melee stacking. So Banner of War used to buff melee damage by 40%. And now they've reduced it so that when you're using Syntheseps, it's down to 1.15%, so 15%, and Worm Gods is down to 1.1 or 10% based on how many Worm God stacks you have. Okay, so they basically nerfed Strand Titan across the board, right? All the strong points of using Banner of War and meleeing have been nerfed. I think these changes are good. I think overall, these changes are good. Woven Mail is a lot less accessible. You really need to actually use an ability to get 10 full seconds of Woven Mail, I believe. So for example, Into the Fray, throwing a Tangle, or grappling with like Certarachnes, or using Navigator, something like that. There's a lot of different ways to get Woven Mail, but you're gonna have to use those ways to get 10 seconds instead of 5, right? And I think all of this is not necessarily an over nerf, right? I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because I think Frenzied Blade is still very strong. Like, you'll still be able to use 1-2 punch with Frenzied Blade, and I think they want to really restrict Banner of War to being this class where you have good sustain, but you're not able to just spam grapple melees, but you still have relatively good burst uptime on majors, right? So if you have Into the Fray and a 1-2 punch shotgun, you can bang, you can Frenzy Blade like a champion or like a major or like a knight or something, and then turn him into a tangle, throw the tangle down, and you have more sustain. So it's much more of a sustain class now than it is like a rapid, aggressive, just all the time in your face kind of class. It's just more focused on keeping your woven mail uptime good and maybe occasionally bursting down a major. So that is basically all I have to say about the abilities tuning patch. I'm very happy with this patch actually. A lot of these changes are very tasteful and affect areas of the sandbox that I didn't think Bungie was necessarily paying attention to. So I like the Thunderclap change, for example. That's great. The knockout change is good. The knock him down internal cooldown change is good. I like the lightweight knife change. Consecration buff is good. They're even paying attention to Goldie chaining, right? Some of these are nice, right? Buffing underperforming supers. These changes were for the most part done pretty tastefully. Yeah, I mean, there's still obviously some room for improvement, right? There's some room to cover, but this is one of the best patches, one of the best dev tuning updates I've ever seen in my life while playing Destiny 2. So proud of Bungie for really kind of cutting at the core of a lot of the problems in the sandbox right now. And I'm excited to see what direction the game moves in. Obviously, some negative changes, right? Like Bubble. I don't think this was a good change. But for the most part, cool stuff, right? Very happy about that. So I'll see you guys later. I will be releasing the double special video in the near future. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this, and I'll see you later.